So after 18 years of making records and mixing records, I've put together a list, or created some data, if you will, of my least favorite and my favorite frequencies based on the instrument or track or vocal. The things I'm going to go over in this video are frequency points that I'm very carefully paying attention to on every single song for thousands of songs now. So when I say F these frequencies, I really mean it. Get yourself your laptop or a pen and paper and get ready to take some notes. Let's do this. Okay, hopefully we can get through this because this mix is a little intense and the computer is dragging a little bit trying to screen capture while playing this mix. So this is a song by Brenna Bone that I produced and mixed for her. It's called Want It Like That. This is not the complete mix because I've pulled some of the mix back apart for the sake of this video. So this is a almost finished mix, but we're gonna go through some stuff. So here's what the song sounds like. Give you just a little taste of the chorus. Okay, so that's the chorus, and what we're gonna start with, let's start with snare drum, how about? Because snare seems to be the most elusive thing, it always was for me. Getting a killer snare sound from real drums was one of the hardest things of my entire career. Okay, so generally I dislike 300 to 400 hertz in the snare drum. So let's take a look at that frequency range in the snare drum and see what it sounds like. If there's too much, I'm gonna boost it and then I'm gonna cut it and let you listen to the difference here. It just has a lot more ring to it, and like overall, I like it way, way less when this frequency range is getting boosted. So what we're gonna do in this particular case is I'm gonna find exactly where I'd like to cut and how much I wanna cut. And we're gonna go just a little bit of time, just a couple dB here. You can almost see that resonance, not that you should mix with your eyes, but you can kind of see the resonance after the snare hit, what's left over right where I'm cutting here at 465 hertz. Now all of this stuff is to taste. You may completely disagree with that, and that's fine. What I'm trying to do is show you the frequency ranges that I really pay attention to. You can handle them however you like. Okay, so that is one of the things that I dislike on snare drum. One of my favorite frequencies on snare drum is like 100 to 200 hertz. This is the thud of a snare drum. So let's look at that. Okay, and then I also really enjoy a high shelf usually on a snare drum. Let's just play around, see what we come up with here. Okay, that's sounding pretty good to me. I'm gonna bypass this, and I'm not level matching, and that people give me grief for this, but that's not how I mix. So, here is bypassed. Cool, that's a good starting point, and that is a good example of what I'm talking about frequencies that I like and dislike. Let's move on to kick drum. Okay, on kick drum, I generally dislike like 300 to 400 hertz, kind of same range. Makes it sound kind of boxy. Let's take a listen to this kick drum. This kick drum sounds pretty good in that range. We're gonna pull down a little bit of like 250 in this case. Like 200 to 400 is usually what I pay attention to cutting in a kick drum. That sounds fine to me. Now, normally I would do all these EQ moves in context. I would do this while listening to all the rest of the music. However, I'm trying real hard here to avoid a copyright strike on this song. Even though this song is not out yet, as soon as it gets released, I'm going to get a copyright strike. So I'm trying to avoid that by only playing single elements. But when you're doing this, do this in context, not with just drums or just a vocal on their own. So that's the frequency that I dislike a lot in kick drum. I really love like 60 to 80 hertz, maybe even up to 100 hertz, depending on the song and the kick drum. So let's take a listen to the low end in this song. That kick drum's thick. Cool, that sounds pretty good. I also like around 6K for kick drum. And so let's see what that sounds like. Now that kick drum's sounding pretty good. Let's bypass it. Cool, sounds great. So this same sort of approach is gonna apply to like all the things that we're gonna talk about. You analyze it, see if you should cut or boost, and then if you should, it doesn't mean just crank on it, just to taste and what's appropriate for the actual track. So on toms, live toms, real toms, or even if they're programmed, real simulated toms, I'm usually cutting around 800 hertz, and I'm usually boosting with a low shelf somewhere in the like 120 range, and I'm usually boosting with a high shelf somewhere in the like 6K range. So that's how I would handle toms. I'm just gonna rip through a bunch of these. Okay, now with like synthesizers, any sort of thick synthesizers, a dirty synth, or a pad or anything like that, it's real common for there to be a lot of buildup in the like 200 hertz range. So here's a dirty synth that's happening during the course of this song. Now that's a pretty thick synth, and sometimes this can get muddy in context. And so paying attention to the like 100 to 200 hertz range, usually closer to 200, sometimes in context, again, I will pull some of that down to keep the overall song from getting muddy, because if you have bass guitar and synthesizer and a pad, and even your regular guitars come down that low, and you know, there's a lot of elements, the bottom end of a snare drum, the top of the top of the bottom end of a kick drum can sometimes reach up into this range. There's a lot of things happening in this like 100 to 250 hertz range. And so in my opinion, I find that a lot of times I will have synthesizers or pads that make the song sound muddy. And so I'm always careful with this frequency range, but here's what I'm talking about. Just that much. So hear how when it's boosted, it just doesn't sound good, but when it's cut, it sounds a lot better in my opinion. So yeah, so that's what I would do on synth. Everything else on a synthesizer or pads is to taste, but I'm careful to pay attention to that frequency on all my pads and synthesizers. All right, let's take a look at some guitars in the chorus of this song, some dirty guitars, rhythm guitar stuff, and let's talk about that. Now, even when I'm not tracking guitars, I played these guitars on this song, but even when I'm not the one playing the guitar, I find that it's extremely common for guitars to be a little scratchy and ice picky and a little bit harsh in the like 2.5 to 3K range, and you can usually see this, not that you should mix with your ears, but you can. Yeah, somewhere in that range. Let's do the other guitar on the other side. It just takes away the harshness and the scratchiness. And then, so that's the frequency that I dislike on guitars, that I'm always very careful to pay attention to. And then I will usually bring some of that clarity back next by paying attention to the low mids. So let's look at the low mids in these guitars. So if we pull some like 270 out of it, somewhere in that range, it should give us the clarity back that we lost by cutting the harshness. And so now we're left with a guitar that is not harsh and also not muddy. In this particular case, a lot of times with guitars, I'll like a high shelf, somewhere between like 6K, maybe somewhere around 6K, so let's do that. Cool, and that feels good in the guitars. Again, in context, do this in context, but I'm just trying to show the principles here. I like high shelves on guitars, and I'm always paying attention to cutting that like 2.5 to 3K range, and I'm always paying attention to cutting somewhere between like 2 and 400 hertz for mud, because when you cut some of that mud out, it brings clarity back. And instead of boosting in that upper mid range, that would enhance the harshness. Let's talk about 808s and program percussion for a second. On 808 kick drums, on 808 kicks, leave them alone. So the point that I would like to get across here is that when you're going to EQ program percussion, snaps, claps, 808s, 808 snares, 808 kicks, make sure that you're doing it for taste, for vibe, to change the tonal characteristics of it. There is almost nothing wrong with these samples, and they sound sonically great just the way they sit. So don't think that you have to adjust them just because you can put an EQ and a compressor on it. Make sure you're doing it with purpose. That's super important. So strings and orchestral instruments, kind of the same thing as guitars mixed with synthesizers. I don't have any on this song, so I'm just going to explain this real quick. I will very commonly pay attention to that like 200-ish hertz range, 100 to 300 on strings, because there can be some buildup there, some muddiness there. And then also with violins and the upper register of cellos and whatnot, you can get some harshness in the same region as the guitars, in that like 2.5 to 3K range. You can get some harshness there. And so I will very commonly in strings and orchestral stuff pay attention to those frequency points, and then everything else is to taste. And then I should also mention that generally across the board with all instruments, I'm paying attention to what's fighting the vocal. And because the vocal is the most important thing in most songs and most genres across the board. So if there's a track, guitars, snare drums, synthesizers, strings, whatever it is, if there's a track that is fighting the vocal, I'm very careful to make sure that I identify that. And then I will just slowly start pulling some like 1.5K out of that track, like 1 dB at a time, until it's no longer fighting the vocal. Let's take a look at this synthesizer with these vocals, and maybe I can show you an example there. Okay, so here's just the synthesizer and the lead vocal. We're gonna take a look at this.
Rock and roll over red roses, make us 4 to 6.
Okay, now that's not too bad, and again, I would do this in context, but for the sake of this example and trying not to get a copyright strike here, I'm gonna start pulling down some like 1.5 to 2K while both are playing, and just listen to how the vocal starts being given its own space as I do this. Just a couple dB. Here we go.
Rock and roll over red roses, make us 4 to 6 to get us going. You know I love it when you're wild side showing. You and me in the backseat, we're wrapped tight. I want it like you want.
Okay, I'm gonna bypass this and put it back in and take a listen.
Rock and roll over red roses, us 4 to 6 to get us going. You know I love it when you're wild side showing. You and me in the back.
Now, I don't know how well this is going to come across over YouTube, and this is a subtle thing, but this is something that I pay attention to all tracks, and I'll identify there's usually 2 or 3 or 4 elements in a mix in almost every song and almost every genre that will conflict with the vocal a little bit. Somewhere between like 1K and like 2.5 is where like the presence of a vocal, the punch of a vocal sits. And I will pay very close attention to what other instruments might be fighting the vocal in the same frequency spectrum, especially instruments that are panned right up the center or that are stereo panned left and right effectively up the center. Again, I want to reiterate, all this stuff should be to taste. You should not automatically do any of these things. You should make your own decisions for how much or how little of this you'd like to do. Okay, so let's take a look at vocals here. Now, one of the very first things that I do on vocals, almost without listening, is I will high pass the vocal if it hasn't been high passed before. So I guess I would listen to see if it's been high passed, but if it hasn't, I high pass almost immediately, somewhere around 100 hertz. I'll adjust this to taste as I listen to the track and we work our way through it. Now, the very next thing that I almost always do to almost all vocals is I really like high shelves. So I will go ahead and put a high shelf in. Here we go.
Rock and roll over red roses, make us 4 to 6 to get us going. You know I love it when you're wild side showing. You and me in the backseat, we're wrapped tight. I want it like you are.
Something about there. That's like 16 dB at 15K. Sounds awesome to me. Now, one of my least favorite frequencies on vocals is in the like 3 to 500 hertz range. Now, I won't automatically cut this range or look at it until after I've finished EQing the vocal, because oftentimes how I EQ vocals most of the time solves this anyway. But so the very next thing that I would do is I usually boost some like 1K, and again, I can't stress this enough, in context while listening to the rest of the music. I wish I could without getting a copyright strike. This video may get a copyright strike anyway. But so I would boost like somewhere between 1 and 1.5K on a lot of vocals, to taste, of course. So let's do that.
Rock and roll over red roses, make us 4 to 6 to get us going. You know I love it when you're wild side show.
There we go. That feels really good to me. Kind of helps punch the vocal, gives it a little bit more clarity. Now, I like to make sure the vocals have the proper amount of weight. This is certainly to taste, because your taste in music and your taste in mixing may completely disagree with this, and that's okay. These principles still apply. So I will pay attention to boosting somewhere between 1 and 200 hertz on this vocal to thicken it up. How thick and how much weight can I give the vocal without it making it sound muddy or woofy or boxy and lack clarity? So let's do that.
Rock and roll over red roses, make us 4 to 6 to get us going. You know I love it when you're wild side showing. You and me in the backseat, we're wrapped tight. I want it like you always know how to take control. When to speed it up and when to take it.
Okay. I like that, at least listening real quickly, but the principle here is what we're paying attention to. Now, effectively, when I said earlier that 300, 400 hertz range, 300 to 500 hertz that I don't really care for in a vocal, because I've boosted these frequency ranges solving other problems on almost every vocal, I've sorted this range out, because there's 300 right there, all the way over to 500. I've already kind of sorted this out on almost every vocal. However, it is a frequency range that I pay attention to on every vocal. So once I've gotten the EQ like this, I will pay attention to, do I need to cut some of that still? And a lot of times the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is yes. Still a very important frequency for me that I pay attention to on every single song. Okay, let's talk about harmonies real quick, because this is something I don't see a lot of people discussing. And the same would generally be for doubling and tripling vocals, but we're going to go with harmonies for this particular instance. Now, in the same way that I talked talked about other instruments fighting the vocal. That's the most important thing to me when it comes to harmonies. I will pay very close attention to if the harmony is fighting the lead vocal. I want them to sit alongside each other and complement each other and never be fighting each other. And so for me, what that usually means is I'm always looking at somewhere between 1K and 2.5K to see if I need to pull some of that range out of the harmony so it doesn't fight the lead vocal. So let's take a listen here.
Rock and roll over red roses.
This is a pretty good example. So I'm going to pull some of this range out, like somewhere between 3 and 6 dB while it's playing, and listen how it just gives the lead vocal more space.
Rock and roll over red roses. Make us 4 to 6 to get us going.
So now the lead vocal has much more space and the harmony is still clearly audible. Same thing with the other vocals. I'm going to high pass this somewhere around 100. And then on this particular one, since it's a high harmony, I'm going to give it a high shelf as well. Come on, computer. My computer does not like screen recording while a finished mix is playing. So let's push some high shelf up and see where we get to.
Rock and roll over red roses. Make us 4 to 6 to get us going.
So about 6 dB at like 11.5K. And so to me, this sounds way better. The harmony is not fighting the vocal. It's fighting the vocal much, much less while still being perfectly legible, and there's obviously a harmony still happening there. That's a win-win in my book. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon next to the subscribe tab for more content like this, and it means the world to me if you guys would subscribe. I know a lot of you guys watch the videos over and over and you're not subscribed, so go ahead and hit that little tab. It means a lot to me. There are obviously a whole lot more tracks that we could discuss for this video. However, these are the tracks that I will do kind of the same thing on every song to taste, of course, and as long as it's necessary for the track. So I didn't want to discuss things that I don't always look at particular frequency spectrums for, but I hope this helped you. These are some things that really helped my mixes come to life, and I hope it does the same to you. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to check links in the description for all the gear that I use and plugins that I used in this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.